Good morning. My name is Michael Conley. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations, and today is February 28th. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the school department's FY23 school budget, and particularly focus on the Chapter 70 program and the state budget, and sort of to highlight in about 10 minutes or less what it sort of means for North Reading. So the state budget was released about a month ago on January 26th, and it certainly included some increases to Chapter 70 aid, which was quite substantial over previous years. The increase was $485 million, or 8.8%. Government local aid increased by $31.5 million, or 2.7%. There was certainly a funding of increase in charter school reimbursement in that program by $65 million, so that was substantial. Special education circuit breaker program, which reimburses school districts for special education out of district tuition and transportation costs above a certain threshold per pupil, by $41 million, or 11%. So that program continues to be supported and fully funded. Homeless transportation was reimbursed by $8 million, or increased by $8 million, so that program continues to be supported. The Student Opportunities Act, which was an act that got approved a few years ago, that provides additional aid through the Chapter 70 foundation budget for low-income students, ELL, special education costs, employee health benefits, etc., was certainly fully funded in the year 2 of this kind of phase-in model. And we'll get into a little bit more about the Student Opportunities Act in a moment, but it was essentially a commitment to increase funding over potentially by about $1.5 billion over a 7-year period through the Chapter 70 formula, by supporting increases in those major components of the foundation budget to really better accurately reflect year increases that districts and municipalities are experiencing. For years, they were certainly underfunded through the foundation budget. And then the minimum aid per pupil funding, which is the amount that, believe it or not, has the greatest impact for North Reading, based on where we're at with the formula, was increasing by $30 per pupil. So again, the January 26th budget for the governor was just the beginning stages of the state budget. It still needs to move on from the House and then to the Senate and then to the conference committee, and it quite honestly would not be officially approved until mid to late June. State budget process, as I mentioned earlier, was this Student Opportunities Act, and this, as I said earlier, was a second year of a 6-year phase-in, and this was certainly supported by the governor's budget. Inflation was a huge increase this year, the highest we've seen ever in the history of the Chapter 70 program, at 5.9%. Really, I think probably having the biggest impact on the Chapter 70 aid increasing by $485 million, which was its highest in recent increase prior to this year's $485 million, or over 8%, was the $269 million in fiscal year 20. So certainly quite a big increase this year. And then enrollment, which also has the other kind of big impact on foundation budgets and Chapter 70, along with inflation and Student Opportunities Act and so forth. Many districts that were impacted by enrollment changes due to the COVID-19 pandemic has not seen that kind of rebounded this year as most sort of expected. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. In terms of North Reading, that is a factor that didn't significantly impact North Reading. So Chapter 70 formula and how it's determined and calculated. So it's certainly a kind of a 3-step process. Step 1 with that would be calculating the foundation budget, which is essentially represents the minimum spending level needed to provide an adequate education. So the foundation budget is sort of adjusted every year due to changes in enrollment, changes in inflation, as I spoke to earlier. Those two components certainly have perhaps maybe the biggest impact on the foundation budget. And then the third major factor is what's known as this kind of wage adjustment factor. So certainly a district's foundation budget influenced by these three factors. The wage adjustment factor gives a district credit for having higher school costs if it's located in a geographic area where the average wages are higher than other areas of the state. So the wage factor is calculated using the latest available average wage data that's supplied by the state's Department of Employment. So that has a factor, certainly, but I think the two biggest factors are changes in a district's foundation enrollment, which is those students that a district is financially responsible for, and then changes to inflation. So the foundation budget is determined as step one. Step two would be determine what a community can afford. So that is the local contribution requirement. So it's basically attempting to compute how much of that foundation budget should be paid for by each city or towns through property tax based upon the relative wealth of a community. So the foundation budget is calculated, and then the local contribution, required local contribution, is calculated, which takes into account mainly these three factors, which is the property values within the community, the median income values within that community, and then something that's certainly known as the municipal revenue growth factor, and that has been calculated really each year since going back to fiscal year 94 by the Department of Revenue, and it attempts to quantify the most recent annual percentage change in each community's local revenues, such as the annual increase in the Proposition 2.5 levy limit that should be available for schools. So again, these three factors, biggest factors is probably for a community like North Reading is property values, and then income value and median income values. But then this municipal revenue growth factor does play a role in calculating what a community can afford. So essentially, you calculate those two areas, and then essentially the difference becomes your state aid. So that's the final step in the process, is determining what state aid a community gets by essentially subtracting the foundation budget from the local contribution requirement. Most districts, including North Reading, spend more than the minimum by an average of about 20%. North Reading in FY22 spent approximately 30% more than what they're required to spend. And most communities are in that type of scenario as well. So if you get into the FY23 numbers and how it compares towards FY22 for North Reading, you can see some of the changes that at play. Slight change in foundation enrollment by an additional 5 students. So unlike other communities, North Reading was not severely impacted by changes to the foundation enrollment. We did not see many students make changes or kind of go to private or Catholic or parochial or virtual or homeschooling that some other communities saw during the pandemic. We saw some of that, but it certainly was no way near the level that some of these other communities across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts experienced. So that has sort of minimal impact on North Reading. And you can see the foundation budget going up by $1.9 million. I think the biggest factor in that is certainly the inflation, because enrollment stayed relatively steady for North Reading. So I think what's at play in that $1.9 million increase is the significant increase to the inflation, as well as the governor's attempt to fund the Student Opportunities Act, which is to make certainly changes to those areas like special education, benefits, ELL costs, and so forth reflect actual increases. Then the required local contribution has been calculated, which we just discussed. And then our Chapter 70 aid is a little more than 7.2 million. So North Reading is, as I've been mentioned in the past, at this time of year is sort of a minimum aid community, meaning that we would receive 17.5% if we were at our target. But for whatever reason, back in 1993 with the Educational Reform Act and when the formula started, North Reading has kind of become a little bit of out of whack of where the formula feels like we should be in relation to our target aid. We're rather significantly above our target by about 10%. So in the eyes of the Chapter 70 formula, North Reading is receiving a little more than $2 million more than it should. So we will always kind of default to a minimum aid community. We don't kind of qualify for down payment aid or foundation aid. We kind of default to the minimum aid, which when you go back to that first slide I showed was the $30 per pupil. So $30 times the $2,248 is the $67,440, which is why North Reading is receiving that increase. Because we're 10% above our target, we are receiving more aid in the eyes of the formula than we should. So our required net school spending amount is much higher than our foundation budget, and that's because we're receiving about $2 million more aid. So we're required to spend that amount, certainly on education. So if the formula was working as the state feels like it should, we would be closer to our target at 17.5%. The amount of our foundation budget and by subtracting our required local district contribution would equal our Chapter 70 aid. And then our required net school spending amount would be at our foundation budget. But because this scenario is out of whack, then we're receiving $2 million kind of more in Chapter 78, and therefore need to spend that on education. So that's sort of the scenario that North Reading's been at for a while as a minimum aid community. And this chart kind of indicates that districts receive different levels of Chapter 78 because their municipal's ability to pay differs. So North Reading, again, is about that 26% of state aid compared to our local contribution. And you can sort of see where North Reading stands in relation to some other areas. As I mentioned earlier, North Reading's target aid is actually a lot less at 17.5%. So we're above our target, where other communities that are considered affluent minimum aid communities in relation to the formula are at their target, like Stoneham and Westwood. So this is sort of the biggest factor, I think, at play that's sometimes overlooked, that's having the biggest impact on North Reading and what type of increases we can expect to receive as we project to the future. So the Student Opportunities Act is great, certainly helping a lot of communities. But I think when you look at North Reading as a community and you project to the future in terms of our Chapter 70, I think we're not going to see significant changes for a number of years. It's almost like we're sort of immune from Student Opportunity Act adjustments and funding. We're sort of always going to be eyeing what the minimum aid per pupil funding level is at, which has been at $30 per pupil for quite some time. So this sort of scenario kind of continues to be at play when you look at North Reading's Chapter 78 increases. We are a minimum aid community, and we kind of default to that $30 per pupil amount, which has been what it has been funded at for a number of years. So that's why you see very stable increases, because our enrollment has been relatively the same at about 400 students. We are at that $68,000 increases in Chapter 70 for a number of years, and we're only qualifying for minimum aid. So as I mentioned earlier, you're not seeing that down payment aid qualification or foundation aid. So back in fiscal 17, I think the minimum aid was funded at about $50 per pupil, so we received a little bit more money, or $55 per pupil. So that's sort of the trend that North Reading has been at. If you look at what our spending level has been in relation to our requirement, as I said earlier, most districts in the state spend more than what they're required to spend. North Reading's been about between 25 and 30%. So you can see our actual net school spending is trending line higher than our requirement, and most communities also meet that need. So where the orange is the Chapter 70, foundation is the striped blue line, and this is in relation. So we don't receive a lot of Chapter 70 aid, but most of what our funding comes from the local appropriation and property tax level, but we do spend more than what we're required to spend, and we are in a very similar situation for most other districts in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So if you look at this graph, you can see that most spend between 20 to 50% more than they're required to do so. So North Reading would fit in this scenario with 129 other districts that are spending more than their requirement on education. So North Reading, as a minimum aid community, is also in line with 42% of other districts in the state. So we're very much sort of the average or within the majority of what's going on with Chapter 70 in terms of us being a minimum aid or 17.5% aid district, where there's 42% of other districts in the state also meet that scenario, and we would fall under this district here, 135 other districts in the light purple minimum aid, and then the other 183 or 58% are qualifying for foundation aid or other types of down payment aid in relation of the Chapter 70 formula. So if you look at North Reading, this is the scenario that we've been at for quite some time, really going back till fiscal year 10, so for over a decade. Our actual Chapter 70 state aid amounts has been averaging anywhere between 5 and 10%, really above our target. So as long as this scenario exists and we're not sort of at our target, then we're going to continue to not see significant increases in Chapter 70, even regardless if there's major changes in funding due to Student Opportunities Act initiatives and other foundation budget increases initiatives. I think North Reading would be at that minimum aid funding level because of the scenario at play. So you may ask, kind of, why would this have happened? I think it's a lot to do with the sort of the hold harmless clause, that no district would receive less aid than what they did the year before. So because we were sort of at one time considered maybe a less affluent district and above a minimum aid funding level, and receiving $7+ million in aid, when we sort of became kind of that minimum aid community, when changes around fiscal 07, fiscal year 09 occurred with the formula, because we were then above our target, and that whole harmless clause kind of made sure we weren't going to have any aid taken away. This scenario is at play, and this is sort of the challenge that North Reading, the predicament that North Reading is currently in. So it's almost like, when we here, Student Opportunities Act and many folks in the community, stakeholders, then expect that, when are we going to see these increases that I'm hearing about, that Chapter 78 is being funded and this $485 million increases, and, why are we only seeing $65,000 of that? It's confusing because Chapter 70 is not a one-size-fits-all formula. It does different things for different communities based on where they're at. And this is really the biggest reason why, is because we're so far above our target, and that's been the case for really over a decade, and it appears to be a case going forward. So you can kind of see how we compare to some of the communities in the geographic area in terms of where we are at in relation to our target. As I mentioned earlier, North Reading is here about 10% above our target aid with a dark blue, where other communities like Linfield, Wakefield are right at their target. Wilmington is even further above, away from their target than we are. And Reading has been slowly inching a little bit closer to their target. So that's why one certainly kind of hot topic issue is, working towards doing something like universal free full-day kindergarten. Communities in the area like Linfield and Wakefield have been able to do that over the last 5 years, and I think in large part they were able to do that because those two communities are at their target, so that when they made that such a change, they got an influx of additional state aid to help offset the loss of a tuition-based kindergarten program, full-day kindergarten program, where communities like Reading and North Reading are still charging a tuition. Both of those communities are working hard to reduce that tuition over the last few years, and working towards, hopefully in the near future, certainly North Reading is, to be able to offer a free full-day kindergarten program. But we're sort of phasing that in because we're in a situation, because of this formula at play, that we're not going to see really a big increase in state aid, where other communities, Wakefield, Stoneham, Linfield, were able to do so. So that was really my presentation. I hope it helped provide some additional information about the budget, and in particular the Chapter 70 state aid program. We're just getting into our budget process here in North Reading. You can follow these links on the website and myself on Twitter to get most updated presentations and so forth that will be occurring really over the next several weeks, from the beginning of March through the end of April, in regards to North Reading School Department's fiscal 23 budget. Great. Thank you for joining me. Hope you have a great day.